Now, let's use this concept to solve quadratic equations. We have solved quadratic equations by graphing and by factoring. Well, graphing and factoring might not always work, okay? So we have this other method. It's called the square root method. Now, the square root method doesn't work on all quadratic equations. It only works on quadratic equations that are in the form ax squared plus c equals 0. Okay? If you remember, this is the standard form of a quadratic equation. You can use the square root method when it's in this form. So when there is no x term, and there's only an x squared. So if you have a quadratic equation in which it doesn't have a linear term, an x term, then you can use the square root method. So again, to use the square root method, it has to have only an x squared. It can't have an x squared and an x. So if you look at all these equations I have up here only has an x squared. So I can use the square root method on them. So what you do to use the square root method is you get the x squared by itself. So on this first example, A, I would subtract 15 from both sides. So I get x squared is equal to 87 minus 15, which is 72. Now the reason it's called the square root method is because once you get the x squared by itself, see how I have just an x squared over here? What you want to do now is take the square root of both sides. The square root of x squared cancels out and you just get x. Now it's important that you remember to do this. When you take the square root method, what you got to do is you got to put plus and minus on your answer. So x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 72. That's my answer. But just like we did on the first slide, you want to make sure your square root is simplified. 72 is not a perfect square. So I got to find the largest perfect square that divides into 72. And that's 36. 36 goes into it twice. So the solution, or the roots, to example A would be x equals plus or minus 6 square root of 2. That has two solutions. It's just a shorthand notation of writing it. The two roots are 6 radical 2 and negative 6 radical 2. But if you don't want to write it out twice like that, you just put a plus and minus in front of the number. All right, let's do B. So to solve for B, we would first add 17 to both sides. So we get 2x squared equals 25 plus 17 is 42. Then I would divide both sides by 2. I get x squared equals 21. That's what x squared is. I want to know what x is. So now I take the square root of both sides. These cancel out, so I just get x. And whenever you do the square root method, you gotta put this plus and minus on your answer. So it's the square root of 21. Now, if you think about our perfect squares, we got 1, but 1 really doesn't count, that goes into everything. Then we got 4, 9, 16, 25, right? So these 4, 9, and 16 are the only numbers that are possible that can divide into 21. Does 4, 9, or 16 divide into 21? It doesn't. So 21 doesn't have a perfect square that goes into it. So you can't reduce the square root of 21. It's already simplified. So this is your answer. X equals plus or minus the square root of 21. You just leave it like that. All right, let's try these last two examples. So C, we would subtract 19 from both sides. We'll get x squared equals 46 minus 19 is is 27. Take the square root of both sides. So x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 27. Can the square root of 27 be reduced? Does 27 have a perfect square that divides into it? It does. 9 goes into it 3 times. So my final solution is x equals plus or minus 3 square root of 3. Right, one last one. B, let's add 81 to both sides. We get 4x squared equals 81. Divide both sides by 4. 4 doesn't go to 81 evenly, so just leave it as a fraction. Can't be reduced. So we got x squared equals 81 over 4. So now take the square root of both sides. Square root of both sides. When you take the square root of a fraction, the easiest thing to do is just break it down into 2 square roots. So this will equal plus or minus the square root of 81 over the square root of 4. And both 81 and 4 are perfect squares. So my final simplified answer is x equals plus or minus 9 over 2. Right, I'm going to take it one more step a little further.